What if everything we thought we knew about French ancestry was wrong? For centuries, France has been seen as a blend of Celtic, Roman, and Germanic roots, an expected mix for a country at the heart of Europe. But when scientists started digging deeper into French DNA, the results were anything but predictable. Instead of a simple genetic story, they uncovered something astonishing: a country split into distinct genetic groups, shaped by ancient migrations, natural barriers, and even historical disasters. The first major shock: France doesn't have just one genetic identity. It has at least 6. Unlike other European countries where genes blend smoothly across regions, France is genetically fragmented. Northern France, for example, shows strong genetic ties to Germany and Belgium, while the people of Brittany have more in common with the Welsh and Irish than they do with their own countrymen. Meanwhile, in the southwest, the Basques remain an entirely separate genetic group, holding onto DNA that dates back thousands of years, completely untouched by later European migrations. How did this happen? One explanation lies in France's geography and history. While countries like Germany and Spain have fewer natural obstacles, France is divided by rivers, mountains, and coastlines, all of which acted as genetic barriers, keeping populations separate for thousands of years. The Loire River, for instance, has been a hidden genetic divide, splitting France into a northern zone with strong Central European influence and a southern zone with a heavier Mediterranean mix. But the real game changer: the unexpected impact of steppe ancestry. Thousands of years ago, groups linked to the Yemnaya people of the Eurasian steppes swept into Western Europe, bringing what we now call Indo-European languages. Their influence is visible in many European countries, but in France, it's far from uniform. Brittany, for example, has some of the highest levels of steppe DNA in the country, on par with Ireland and Scotland, while the Basques have almost none at all. This genetic gap isn't just an interesting historical footnote. It's something that actively shapes disease risks, physical traits, and even cultural identity in modern France. Another surprising twist: the British connection. For centuries, historians suspected a link between Brittany and the British Isles, but DNA has now proven it beyond doubt. The Bretons share more genetic material with the Welsh and Cornish than they do with Parisians. The reason? Ancient migrations across the English Channel, reinforced by cultural ties that lasted for over 1,000 years. Even today, Brittany's genetic makeup remains closer to its Celtic cousins across the water than to the rest of France. But here's where things get even stranger. The Black Death, the deadliest plague in history, didn't just kill millions, it reshaped France's genetic future. When the plague wiped out entire towns in the 14th century, it removed certain genetic lines and allowed others to dominate future generations. This means that the genetic landscape of France today is not just the result of ancient migrations, but also of who survived history's deadliest disease outbreaks. All of this challenges a fundamental question: what does it really mean to be French? Unlike what many once believed, France is not a single genetic entity. It's a mosaic of different ancestries, shaped by ancient migrations, natural barriers, and historical events that changed the course of human survival. Your DNA could connect you to Ireland, Spain, Germany, or even prehistoric hunter-gatherers. But what makes France truly unique is how all these pieces have come together to create one of the most genetically diverse nations in Europe. So, does this change how you think about French ancestry? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to dive deeper into the fascinating world of genetics, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. For centuries, historians and archaeologists have pieced together France's past through records, ruins, and legends. But now, genetics is rewriting that history in ways no one expected. DNA evidence reveals that France's genetic roots are far more complex, diverse, and mysterious than previously believed. Scientists are uncovering hidden migrations, long-lost bloodlines, and even unexpected genetic ties to faraway lands. One of the biggest surprises: the survival of ancient hunter-gatherer DNA in modern French populations. Thousands of years ago, before the first farmers arrived from the Middle East, Europe was home to a dwindling population of hunter-gatherers. Most of their genetic legacy was wiped out by the Neolithic migration, but in certain regions of France, especially along the Atlantic coast, this DNA persisted far longer than expected. Even today, people in Brittany and parts of southwestern France carry higher than average levels of this ancient ancestry, a reminder of a lost chapter in Europe's human story. But the surprises don't stop there. Genetic research has also exposed a clear divide between northern and southern France, a divide that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Northern France's population has a strong Central European genetic influence, thanks to waves of migration from the Germanic and Celtic tribes. In contrast, the south has far more Mediterranean ancestry, closely linked to Spain, Italy, and even ancient Greek colonists. The Loire River, once thought to be just a geographical landmark, turns out to be a genetic boundary, separating these two populations in ways that are still visible in modern DNA. Even more astonishing is the unexpected British connection. The people of Brittany are not just culturally Celtic, they are genetically linked to the Welsh and Cornish. This isn't just a coincidence, it's the result of actual migration. Around 1,500 years ago, during the collapse of the Roman Empire, waves of Britons fled across the English Channel to escape war and famine, settling in what is now Brittany. DNA confirms that their genetic imprint is still strong today, making the Bretons one of the closest genetic relatives of the Celtic populations of the British Isles. Another revelation: the ghost of the Bell Beaker culture, one of Europe's most mysterious prehistoric civilizations. The Bell Beaker people, who lived around 4,500 years ago, left behind strange, distinctive pottery and advanced metalworking techniques. But until recently, little was known about their origins. Now, DNA shows that they weren't just a cultural movement, they were an actual migrating population, bringing large amounts of steppe ancestry into Western Europe. And guess what? The highest concentrations of this DNA in France are not in the north, but in Brittany. This means that while much of the Bell Beaker genetic influence faded elsewhere in France, it remained strong in the northwest, linking Brittany to other ancient steppe-influenced populations like the early Irish and Scots. But perhaps the most shocking discovery of all, a forgotten African connection buried deep in French history. DNA testing has revealed that some medieval individuals from France carry traces of North African ancestry, dating back over 1,000 years. One skeleton, found in western France and dated to the 5th or 6th century, had clear genetic links to North Africa. How did this happen? The answer likely lies in Rome's vast empire, which connected people from across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Soldiers, traders, and slaves moved between these regions, leaving behind genetic traces that have only now been detected through modern DNA analysis. All of this points to one inescapable truth: France's history is more global, more interconnected, and more surprising than anyone ever imagined. From Ice Age survivors to Celtic migrations, from lost prehistoric cultures to medieval travelers, the DNA of France tells a story of movement, survival, and transformation that challenges everything we thought we knew. So what does this mean for French identity today? If genetics reveals such unexpected ancestral ties, how does that change the way we define heritage, culture, and even nationality? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden stories written in our DNA, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more fascinating discoveries. For decades, historians believed they had a clear picture of France's past. They traced its history through written records, archaeology, and language. But DNA is proving that the real story is far more complicated, mysterious, and unexpected than anyone imagined. From ancient migrations to forgotten civilizations, France's genetic map is revealing hidden chapters of history that were buried for thousands of years. One of the most unexpected revelations is just how much of France's DNA is shaped by ancient, prehistoric movements. Thousands of years before the rise of Rome or the Kingdom of France, waves of people crossed Europe, leaving behind a genetic footprint that still lingers in French DNA today. The oldest of these traces belong to the first hunter-gatherers, who roamed the forests and plains of what is now France as far back as 40,000 years ago. But what's shocking is that their DNA never completely disappeared. Instead, scientists have found that certain regions, particularly in western France, still carry a small but persistent genetic imprint of these Ice Age survivors. Then came the Neolithic Revolution, when farming spread from the Middle East into Europe, replacing hunter-gatherer lifestyles with settled agricultural communities. But rather than a peaceful transition, DNA evidence suggests that this shift may have been more dramatic than previously thought. In many parts of France, the genetic makeup of the population changed almost overnight, as waves of early farmers replaced or absorbed the remaining hunter-gatherers. And yet, genetic traces of these ancient farmers, who originally came from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, are still present in many French people today. But nothing transformed France's DNA more than the arrival of the Bronze Age steppe people, around 4,500 years ago. These nomadic horse riders, who swept across Europe from the Eurasian steppes, brought new technologies, languages, and, most importantly, a completely different genetic profile. And here's where things get truly surprising. While the rest of France absorbed this new ancestry gradually, Brittany holds the strongest concentration of steppe-related DNA in the entire country. In fact, Brittany's genetic makeup is closer to that of Ireland and Scotland than to many other French regions. This suggests a direct link between Brittany and the ancient Celtic world, a connection that runs much deeper than just language and culture. But if the Bronze Age reshaped France's genetic landscape, the Roman and medieval periods added even more complexity. While historians long assumed that Roman influence was mostly cultural, DNA reveals that the Roman Empire left a real genetic mark on France. Roman soldiers, merchants, and settlers, many of whom came from North Africa, the Middle East, and even further east, introduced unexpected genetic diversity into the French population. In some cases, ancient skeletons from Roman-era France have been found with DNA that traces back to North Africa, highlighting the long-forgotten movement of people between these regions. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and another mysterious migration left its mark: the arrival of Britons fleeing from England and Wales. During the 4th to 6th centuries AD, as the Roman Empire crumbled and Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain, waves of Celtic-speaking Britons crossed the English Channel and settled in what is now Brittany. DNA confirms what history books only hinted at, that these migrations weren't small-scale, but significant enough to permanently alter Brittany's genetic makeup. Today, Bretons still carry a striking genetic similarity to the Welsh and Cornish, proving that their ancestors didn't just bring their language and traditions, but also their DNA. And finally, there's one last twist in the story, a link to medieval Spain that many never expected. Scientists have uncovered genetic traces from the Iberian Peninsula in certain parts of France, particularly in the southwest. This suggests a long history of movement between France and Spain, possibly through trade, war, and migration over thousands of years. The presence of Basque-related DNA in southwestern France hints at ancient connections that go beyond modern borders. All of this proves one thing: France's history isn't just written in books, it's written in its people. Every strand of DNA carries a piece of a much bigger story, one that connects France to ancient migrations, lost civilizations, and forgotten journeys. And as genetic research continues, who knows what other hidden secrets might still be waiting to be discovered? Let us know in the comments. Did any of these discoveries surprise you? And if you love uncovering the hidden stories of human history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there's so much more to explore. For centuries, France has been seen as a single, unified country. But beneath the surface, DNA is revealing a hidden genetic map, one that divides France in ways few historians ever imagined. Unlike its modern political borders, France's genetic landscape doesn't follow straight lines. Instead, it tells a story of ancient migrations, cultural shifts, and forgotten populations, each leaving a permanent mark on the DNA of today's French people. One of the most unexpected findings is the genetic divide created by the Loire River. Running through the heart of France, the Loire isn't just a geographical feature. It's a genetic boundary that has separated populations for thousands of years. Studies show that people north of the Loire share more DNA with the British, Germans, and Scandinavians, while those south of the Loire are genetically closer to the Basques and Spanish. This invisible divide, carved by history, suggests that the movements of people, languages, and even genetic traits were shaped as much by rivers as by wars or kingdoms. But perhaps the most distinct genetic region in all of France is Brittany. Unlike the rest of the country, Brittany's DNA is almost entirely unique, with some of the highest levels of steppe ancestry found anywhere in France. This means that long before the Roman Empire, Brittany's ancestors were closely linked to the ancient Celtic and Indo-European migrations that shaped Western Europe. What's even more shocking, Brittany's genetic makeup is more similar to Wales and Ireland than to most of France. This confirms that the historical ties between Brittany and the Celtic world aren't just cultural. They are deeply genetic, stretching back thousands of years. Another isolated pocket of genetic difference is the Basque country, where the Basques have maintained their distinct DNA for thousands of years. Unlike the rest of France, the Basques have almost no trace of steppe ancestry. Instead, their genes closely resemble those of Neolithic farmers, suggesting that their ancestors survived the massive genetic shifts that reshaped the rest of Europe. Even today, Basque DNA remains one of the most genetically unique in all of Western Europe. But it's not just ancient migrations that shaped France's DNA. In the Middle Ages, a wave of Britons fleeing England and Wales crossed the Channel and settled in Brittany. This medieval migration left a real genetic imprint, strengthening Brittany's ties to the British Isles and further separating it from the rest of France. Even today, DNA studies show a clear genetic link between Bretons, Welsh, and Cornish people, proving that the migration wasn't just cultural, it was biological. And then, there's the Roman influence. While the Roman Empire ruled France for centuries, DNA tells a more complex story. Surprisingly, genetic analysis suggests that Rome's biggest impact wasn't in the north, but in the south. In regions like Provence and Languedoc, DNA evidence points to Roman settlers from Italy, the Middle East, and North Africa mixing with the local population. This genetic legacy is a reminder of how the empire reshaped the Mediterranean world, creating a mix of ancestries that still lingers in France today. One of the most surprising revelations is how little France's core genetic structure has changed over the past 1,000 years. Despite wars, revolutions, and shifting borders, the genetic clusters found in medieval France are almost identical to those seen today. This suggests that while history may have shaped France's culture and politics, its deep genetic roots have remained remarkably stable. So, what does all of this mean? It means that France isn't just one country with one genetic identity. It's a mosaic of different ancestral stories, shaped by geography, migration, and time. Every region carries its own unique genetic fingerprint, telling the story of ancient settlers, lost kingdoms, and forgotten connections. And as scientists continue to unlock the secrets of DNA, who knows what other hidden histories are still waiting to be uncovered? For centuries, historians believed that France's population evolved in a steady, predictable way. But when scientists analyzed modern French DNA, they uncovered something completely unexpected: traces of lost civilizations, forgotten migrations, and ancient influences that defy traditional history books. The real story of France's genetic past is far more complex, more mysterious, and more surprising than anyone ever imagined. One of the biggest shocks comes from the medieval period, when France was a battleground of invasions, shifting borders, and cultural exchanges. But instead of wiping out older populations, new genetic evidence suggests that medieval migrations left only subtle imprints on the DNA of today's French people. For example, when Germanic tribes like the Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians entered France after the fall of the Roman Empire, many assumed they reshaped the country's genetic makeup. Yet, DNA studies show that these warrior groups contributed far less to the overall population than previously thought. Instead of a full genetic takeover, the local French populations absorbed these invaders while maintaining their own ancient genetic roots. But the biggest genetic mystery of all might be in Brittany. Scientists expected to find a mixture of French and Celtic ancestry, but instead, Brittany's DNA tells a completely different story. The genes of modern Bretons are strikingly similar to people from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, more so than to the rest of France. This suggests that the medieval migrations of Britons fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions didn't just change Brittany culturally, but fundamentally altered its genetic identity. Even after centuries of French rule, Bretons remain one of the most genetically distinct groups in all of France. Another puzzle lies in Normandy, a region famous for its Viking connections. The Normans, who later conquered England, were originally Scandinavian raiders who settled in France. But how much Viking DNA did they actually leave behind? Surprisingly, genetic studies show that Normandy's population today has only a slight trace of Scandinavian ancestry. Instead of large-scale Viking settlement, it seems that the Norman identity was more about cultural dominance than genetic replacement. The Vikings may have ruled Normandy, but the majority of its people remained genetically French. Yet, while some medieval migrations had less impact than expected, others left hidden genetic fingerprints that still shape France today. One of the most unexpected discoveries comes from North Africa. A DNA analysis of medieval remains in western France revealed an individual with North African ancestry, dating back to the early medieval period. This single discovery hints at long-distance migration routes that connected France to the wider Mediterranean world long before modern globalization. The genetic exchange between France and North Africa may have been happening centuries earlier than previously assumed. And then, there's the question of the Basques. The Basque people of southwestern France have one of the most unique genetic profiles in all of Europe. Unlike most of France, they have almost no trace of steppe ancestry, which means they likely descend from the original hunter-gatherers and early farmers of Europe. Even the Romans, Franks, and later Spanish influences failed to alter their distinct genetic makeup. Incredibly, Basque DNA still carries echoes of some of Europe's most ancient populations, making them one of the last living connections to a prehistoric past. So, what does this all mean? It means that France's genetic history is not a simple story of conquest and assimilation. Instead, it's a tapestry of deep ancestral roots, surprising continuity, and unexpected genetic connections. While empires have risen and fallen, while borders have shifted and rulers have changed, the core DNA of France has remained remarkably resilient, diverse, and full of secrets still waiting to be uncovered. And if medieval France left behind so many mysteries, just imagine what other hidden genetic stories are yet to be discovered. For decades, scientists assumed that France's genetic makeup was well understood, just a blend of ancient Celts, Romans, and Germanic tribes. But modern DNA research has completely shattered that belief. Instead of a simple genetic story, France's DNA reveals unexpected influences from prehistoric migrations, forgotten civilizations, and even long-lost cultures that still shape the country's people today. One of the most shocking discoveries is the deep connection between modern French DNA and a mysterious group from thousands of years ago, the Belgica people. These early Bronze Age travelers spread across Europe over 4,500 years ago, carrying with them not just new technologies, but also a wave of steppe ancestry from Central Asia. Scientists now believe that the genetic imprint of these ancient migrants is strongest along France's northern and western coasts, particularly in Brittany. In fact, some regions in France have more genetic similarities with Bronze Age Britain and Ireland than they do with neighboring parts of France. This suggests that migration and cultural exchange across the English Channel may have been far greater than previously imagined. But the surprises don't stop there. France's southern populations tell a completely different genetic story. Unlike the north, the south of France has much stronger genetic ties to ancient Iberia and the Mediterranean. The people here show higher levels of Neolithic ancestry, indicating a much older and more stable population that predates the arrival of steppe migrants. This difference creates a striking genetic divide along the Loire River, a natural barrier that seems to have separated these two distinct populations for thousands of years. Instead of a single unified genetic background, France is actually a country made up of two very different ancestral lineages. Even more astonishing, some of the oldest genetic traces in France come from a population that predates even the Celts, the Basques. Scientists have long puzzled over the Basque people, who live in southwestern France and northern Spain. Their language is completely unrelated to any other in Europe, and now, DNA confirms that their ancestry is just as unique. Unlike the rest of France, Basques have almost no steppe ancestry, meaning they are direct descendants of Europe's first farmers and hunter-gatherers. Incredibly, their genes have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, making them one of the last living links to Europe's ancient past. But perhaps the biggest revelation comes from medieval France. When researchers examined ancient DNA from the early medieval period, they found something that no one expected: genetic continuity. Despite centuries of invasions from the Romans, Franks, Vikings, and Normans, the overall French gene pool remained remarkably stable. Unlike England, which saw a major genetic shift after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, France seems to have absorbed these invaders without drastically changing its DNA. This means that the modern French people are far more closely related to their medieval ancestors than anyone predicted. Yet, there are still hidden genetic mysteries waiting to be solved. One medieval skeleton found in western France had North African ancestry, proving that migration between France and North Africa was happening far earlier than history books suggest. This single discovery hints at an entire network of long-distance connections that scientists are only beginning to understand. So, what does all of this mean? It means that France's genetic history is not a single, unified story. It's a complex web of migrations, ancient divisions, and long-lasting legacies that still shape the population today. From the mysterious Belbeaker influence in the north, to the ancient Basques in the southwest, to the surprising stability of medieval DNA. Every new discovery challenges what we thought we knew about French ancestry. And as genetic research continues, there's no telling what other hidden secrets might still be buried in France's past. For centuries, people have believed that France's DNA was shaped by well-documented migrations, Celts, Romans, and Franks. But modern genetic research is uncovering something far more unexpected. It turns out that some of the strongest genetic influences in France don't come from these famous groups at all. Instead, they come from forgotten migrations, prehistoric travelers, and ancient cultures that left a much deeper imprint than history books ever suggested. One of the most astonishing discoveries is the genetic footprint of the British Isles in France, particularly in Brittany. When scientists analyzed modern and medieval DNA from northwestern France, they found something shocking. People from this region are genetically closer to the Irish and Welsh than to the rest of France. This isn't just a recent connection. It dates back over 4,000 years, to the arrival of the Belbeaker culture, a mysterious group that spread from Central Europe into Britain, Ireland, and the north of France. Their impact was so strong that the DNA of people in Brittany still carries their genetic signature today. But that's not all. The story of France's DNA isn't just about who arrived, it's also about who stayed. While invaders like the Vikings and Normans left a cultural mark, their genetic impact was much smaller than expected. Instead, France's DNA tells a story of stability, a deep-rooted ancestry that has remained remarkably unchanged for over 1,500 years. Unlike Britain, which saw a major genetic shift after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, France absorbed new arrivals without losing its ancient genetic core. This means that many modern French people are far more connected to their medieval ancestors than anyone predicted. Another surprising revelation comes from southern France, where the genetic influence of the Iberian Peninsula is much stronger than previously thought. The Basque people, who live in southwestern France and northern Spain, carry some of the most ancient DNA in Europe, and their genes have barely changed for thousands of years. Unlike most of Europe, they never fully mixed with steppe migrants or later invaders, making them one of the last surviving links to Europe's prehistoric past. But one of the most mysterious discoveries involves a single medieval skeleton found in western France. When researchers examined its DNA, they were stunned. It had North African ancestry. This means that migration between North Africa and France was happening far earlier than previously believed. This one discovery hints at a hidden history, one that suggests ancient France was far more connected to the wider world than history books ever let on. All of this proves one thing: France's genetic history is anything but simple. It's a story of ancient migrations, lost civilizations, and deep-rooted ancestry that has survived against all odds. And as scientists continue to unlock the secrets hidden in DNA, there's no telling what other surprises may still be waiting to be uncovered. For years, historians have painted a clear picture of France's genetic identity, a country shaped by Roman legions, Celtic warriors, and medieval kingdoms. But modern DNA research is proving something shocking. France's genetic past is not what we thought. Some of the most dominant ancestral influences don't come from the groups we've always considered French. Instead, they come from forgotten migrations, prehistoric settlers, and connections to distant lands that history barely mentions. One of the biggest revelations comes from the Loire River, a natural border dividing northern and southern France. Genetic studies show that this river isn't just a geographic boundary, it's also a genetic one. People north of the Loire share high levels of ancestry with the British and Germanic populations, while those in the south have stronger genetic links to Iberia and the ancient Basques. This split is so deep that it can be traced back thousands of years, showing that France has been genetically divided long before the country itself even existed. And then, there's the mystery of the Bretons. DNA has confirmed something fascinating. Bretons are not like the rest of France. Their closest genetic relatives aren't in Paris, Lyon, or Marseille. Instead, they're in Wales, Ireland, and Cornwall. This means that, at some point in history, a massive migration from the British Isles reshaped the genetic landscape of northwestern France. But when exactly did this happen? And why? Some historians link it to the fall of the Roman Empire, when waves of Britons fled to Brittany, bringing their language and culture with them. Others suggest that these connections go back even further, to a time when prehistoric sailors moved freely between Britain and France. But perhaps the most unexpected discovery is that France's DNA hasn't changed as much as we once thought. In many parts of the country, people still carry the same genetic markers as their ancestors from over 1,000 years ago. This means that, while cultures and empires have risen and fallen, the core of France's population has remained strikingly stable. Even the great Viking invasions left surprisingly little genetic impact. Instead of replacing the local population, they were absorbed into it, leaving more of a cultural legacy than a genetic one. And then, there's a truly astonishing find, a single medieval skeleton from France with North African ancestry. This discovery suggests that connections between France and North Africa were already happening hundreds of years earlier than previously thought. It rewrites the history of migration, proving that people traveled, settled, and mixed across vast distances long before modern globalization. So, what does all of this mean? It means that France's genetic story is far more complex than we ever imagined. It's a story of ancient borders, lost migrations, and surprising connections that challenge everything we thought we knew. And with every new DNA study, scientists are uncovering even more hidden secrets, proving that France's genetic history is still full of surprises. For centuries, historians have assumed that France's genetic diversity came from well-documented events, Roman conquests, medieval wars, and waves of European migration. But what if we told you that some of the most influential DNA in France doesn't come from any of these sources? Instead, it comes from a prehistoric population that vanished, but still exists in French blood today. Deep within France's genetic makeup, scientists have found traces of an ancient people whose DNA is unlike any other in Europe. These are the Western hunter-gatherers, a group that lived in Europe thousands of years before farming was even invented. While they were eventually displaced by early farmers from the Middle East, DNA studies show that their bloodline never truly disappeared. Instead, it survives in unexpected places, most notably in the remote coastal regions of France. And here's where it gets even stranger. The Basques, a population in southwestern France and northern Spain, seem to be their closest living relatives. Unlike most Europeans, who have a mix of ancient farmer and steppe ancestry, the Basques have far less outside influence. Their DNA suggests they descend directly from some of the earliest Europeans, people who hunted, gathered, and survived in France thousands of years before history was written. But if the Basques are the last true remnants of this prehistoric population, why do so many French people still carry their genes? Scientists believe it's because of hidden isolation zones, areas where geography, culture, or historical events prevented mixing with outside groups. One of the biggest examples is Brittany, where DNA studies have found an unusually high amount of hunter-gatherer ancestry. The reason? Brittany was one of the last places in France to adopt farming, and for thousands of years, its population stayed relatively isolated. But Brittany isn't the only place where ancient genes still linger. Researchers have also found a genetic echo of the past in the forests, mountains, and river valleys of central France. These areas, once thought to be historically unremarkable, are now proving to be genetic time capsules, places where the blood of Europe's first inhabitants has remained remarkably intact. Even more astonishing, some of these ancient genetic markers have been linked to modern health traits. Certain mutations found in Western hunter-gatherer DNA may explain why some French populations have unique responses to diseases, or why certain genetic conditions, like hemochromatosis, are more common in France than in other parts of Europe. So what does this tell us? It proves that France's genetic history is far older and more complex than we ever imagined. The country isn't just shaped by kings, wars, and revolutions. It's shaped by the survivors of a lost world, whose DNA still lives on in the blood of millions. And the more scientists dig into France's genetic past, the more they realize that some of its deepest roots stretch back to a time before history itself even began. For decades, geneticists believed that modern France was shaped by three major migrations: early farmers from the Middle East, horse-riding warriors from the Eurasian steppes, and medieval movements like Viking raids and the Roman conquests. But a recent DNA breakthrough has shattered that belief. Deep inside the genetic code of the French people, scientists have discovered something completely unexpected, a mystery lineage that doesn't fit into any known migration pattern. It's not Roman, not Celtic, and not even Viking. Instead, it seems to come from a long-forgotten population that once thrived in France but left barely any historical trace. So who were they? And why has their DNA remained hidden for so long? One of the biggest clues comes from a strange genetic link between the French and an isolated group in the Middle East. Researchers found that some French genetic markers closely match those of populations in Iran and the Caucasus, places that were never known to have significant migration into France. And yet, the DNA evidence is undeniable. Something, or someone, brought these genes into France thousands of years ago. But that's not even the most surprising part. In a shocking twist, some of these genetic markers aren't found in other Western European populations, meaning that whatever group introduced them to France may have vanished everywhere else. This is an ancient genetic ghost, an entire people erased from history, except in the DNA of modern-day France. And the mystery gets even deeper. These genes aren't spread evenly across France. Instead, they cluster in specific regions, particularly in areas that were once thought to be genetic outliers, like Gascony, Brittany, and parts of the Pyrenees. This suggests that rather than a single invasion or migration, these ancient genes may have come in waves, each one leaving behind a small but lasting genetic imprint. Even more astonishing, some of these mystery genes have been linked to unique traits and diseases found in France today. For example, scientists believe they may play a role in why some French populations have higher resistance to certain diseases, different lactose tolerance levels, or even unique physical traits like hair texture and skin tone. So what does this mean? It means France's genetic history is far from fully understood. Every time scientists think they've mapped out the country's past, another hidden ancestry emerges, rewriting everything we thought we knew. And if these forgotten bloodlines still exist in France today, it raises an even bigger question. How many other ancient civilizations have disappeared from history, leaving behind only their DNA? For centuries, historians have tried to piece together France's past through ancient texts and archaeological discoveries. But what if the most accurate record of France's history has been hiding in plain sight, inside the DNA of its people? Recent genetic research has uncovered a stunning revelation. France's population is not as uniform as once believed. In fact, the country is a genetic mosaic, shaped by millennia of unexpected migrations, cultural shifts, and lost civilizations. And some of the most puzzling genetic patterns have only just been discovered. One of the most shocking findings comes from Brittany, where scientists identified a deep genetic link between the Bretons and the ancient Celts of Britain and Ireland. This isn't just a linguistic connection, it's a biological one. The DNA of modern-day Bretons carries clear traces of the same steppe ancestry that spread across the British Isles during the Bronze Age. But there's something even stranger. Breton DNA is different from the rest of France in ways that don't entirely match known historical migrations. The closest genetic relatives of the Bretons aren't even in mainland France. They're across the sea in Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland. This means that at some point, there must have been a large movement of people across the English Channel, possibly during the time of the Roman Empire or even earlier. Could it be that an entire population from Britain fled to France, and their descendants have lived there ever since? Meanwhile, in the south, another genetic mystery has emerged. Researchers have found that people from Gascony and the Pyrenees have DNA markers that match the Basques, but not other modern French populations. This means that while much of France was reshaped by Roman and medieval migrations, the people of this region remained isolated, preserving a genetic legacy that dates back thousands of years. But who were the original Gascons, and why were they so different from their neighbors? Even in the heart of France, there are unexpected genetic surprises. Studies have found that some parts of the country carry traces of ancient DNA that don't match any known European population. Some of these genes are linked to early farmers from Anatolia, while others show mysterious connections to Central Asia. Could this be evidence of forgotten trade routes, lost kingdoms, or even an ancient migration that history has completely erased? What's clear is that France's genetic story is far from complete. Every new DNA study adds another layer of complexity, proving that the history of France is richer, more diverse, and more mysterious than anyone ever imagined. And with each discovery, the past isn't just being uncovered, it's being rewritten.